Chapter 6. Mutated Misfits. It was a hot, muggy, and all-around miserable day to be marching through the Fallwood in plate armor. Alistair found himself again grateful for the blood-red headband he always had tied around his forehead. It did wonders for soaking up the gallons of sweat that poured from his brow. He had briefly considered shaving bald to help with the particularly brutal heat of this year's summer, but Alistair simply couldn't bring himself to cut off his ear-length blonde locks. Besides, if he really did shave it off, by the time winter came, his scalp would surely freeze. Who knew? Maybe hair would never grow there again if he allowed that to happen. No, Alistair would rather keep his scalp the way the pillar gods intended. Nice and warm beneath a head of glorious golden hair. He then gave a small curse as he stumbled over a twig, nearly falling face first into a clump of brambles. There weren't any real trails through the Fallwood, unfortunately, meaning that this journey had been a truly rough one. It didn't help that their donkey had been killed by fiends, leaving them to carry everything on their backs. Look, Elim began with a sigh. All I'm saying is that we have to hurry through here. We don't have the time to go sightseeing in these damn wilds. Alistair sighed and nodded in agreement with Elim. You think I don't know that? Alistair asked. We've been keeping on the path this whole journey. Saying sightseeing makes it sound like a grand old time, but trust me, I'm not liking this either. Knowing that a fiend could be lurking around every tree or bush didn't make the journey any more tolerable. The fiend wall truly must have fallen for so many of the creatures to be prowling about these woods. Thankfully, the fiends had thinned out after the first couple days of this trek, but up until this point the fighting had been constant, as if the forest itself had sent all its fallen creatures to bring down any intruders that dared tread upon this vacant, cursed soil. Alistair might have put more stock in that theory had there not been evidence of Watchers fighting these beasts as well. Watchers were the keepers of the Fallwood, after all. If they had intended to use fiends to ward off visitors, the Watchers wouldn't be killing them off. Mysterious as the Watchers were, though, Alistair truly doubted that they'd allow fiends of all things to simply prowl about unopposed. Sightseeing, Alistair mocked in a high pitch, making a rude gesture to Elim as he did so. Well, I know one of us is, Elim said with yet another sigh, giving a lazy wave toward Twindle. The half-elf woman was further ahead on the path than the majority of the party, walking through the woods with such a look of wonder on her face that it made Alistair struggle to find her sudden occasional stops aggravating. It wasn't even as if she took several minutes per stop. All she did was stop to lean over a flower or to place a hand atop a tree trunk. She looked almost at home. Swap the gleaming plate armor and oversized greatsword that Twindle wore with a Watcher's cloak and some daggers, and she might have looked perfectly at home. Well, maybe not even then. She was a large woman, only shorter than Alistair by a finger, and maybe just as strong as he. Her hair was spun gold, almost gleaming in the sunlight seeping down from between the broad leaves overhead. Her human parent must have been a massive man or woman. Twindle did not seem to know herself, but Alistair didn't want to press the matter. He really wasn't all too curious about her lineage, and he wasn't sure if it was a sensitive topic for her. Alistair would rather avoid making anyone cry. Tears made him uncomfortable. She would sniff every flower in the Fallwood and hug every drowy cursed tree if we had the time. Elim muttered under his breath, shaking his head as Twindle spotted a particularly large tree, quickly moving up to inspect it for a second before again moving on. The crimson-skinned Ifrit likely would have insisted on traipsing about the Fallwood just as Twindle did, had there not been urgent matters pressing them forward. Tuji was right on their tail. That freak was only a few days behind them at most. Not only that, But there was also the matter of the score they all had to settle with Kazan and cursed Fiendwood. Kazan, more so than Tuji, was what forced them into passing through this forest. One couldn't hope to get to the Fiendwood without first passing through the Fallwood, unless they wanted to make a round-the-world journey across every Great Bridge to take a route through the Blastlands. That would be about 200 times more foolish, and Tuji would certainly catch them long before they reached their destination. Alistair's brows knit together in frustration at their pursuit. It wasn't as if they wouldn't be able to defeat Tuji if they all worked together. The problem was that a few of them would certainly die in the resulting battle before Tuji could be brought down. Others had tried to take down the madman in the past, their efforts in vain as they lacked the special talents that Alistair and his friends had. He couldn't even imagine attempting to battle Tuji without the Ada Foundation, an ability that most people lacked. He doubted that these Watchers could draw on the raw golden flame, or at least none of them could do it to Alistair's level. He dearly hoped that none of these elves would try and attack Tuji, or else they would surely be killed. What if that mad bastard tried to challenge the Watchers? The main reason that he and the party fled from the mad half-orc, rather than outright deny the challenge, was that there would be no way for any of them to turn it down once it was issued. Not easily, anyhow. It was simply a part of their nature, something that couldn't be simply ignored. These Watchers, though, they wouldn't be prone to such a thing. Not unless there was one among these sneaky elves that were like Alistair and his friends. He doubted that any normal Watcher would outright accept a challenge from the man either. But who was to say? After all, Alistair did not know how these Watchers did things. Not many people did. He knew that they at least wouldn't attack on sight. One would have to harm the forest in some way to provoke that kind of response. Poaching was a big one, though Alistair had heard that if someone appeared to be on the brink of starvation, the Watchers may let the poaching slide. Wasn't fair to let someone die of starvation when there were plenty of bunnies hopping about. Yet maybe that potential rule only applied during the winter months, when the forest could not yield any sort of fruits or berries to pick. The Watchers wouldn't let anyone get away with cutting down the trees, though. Everyone at least knew that much. That old elf Theopalu dragging his feet up ahead of Twindle would know better than anyone, of course, as he used to be a Watcher himself years back. At least that was what the geezer had claimed before they had hired him. Alistair had never before met an elf that had borne wrinkles before having met Theopalu at that tavern in Greyshane. Despite the deeply furrowed wrinkles, however, the old elf bore no silver hairs in his long black locks. Alistair was only in his 24th year, but already he had some silver strands. That was normal, though, as Alistair himself was a human. Yet Theopalu had to be thousands of years. No, maybe even older than that, to be an elf and have wrinkles. Alistair, and indeed his other companions, had been wondering themselves as to just how old Theopalu must have been. Not that the old codger would spill the beans on anything pertaining to his past, of course. He wouldn't tell them anything about the Watchers either. Not their rules or how they acted upon finding outsiders. It was positively infuriating how much Theopalu held back. What if Alistair stepped on a branch and got an arrow in the throat for snapping a piece of a tree? It would be nice to know at least what not to do. But Theopalu refused to say a word about anything that didn't relate to what they had hired him for. It was either that, or Theopalu couldn't, or more likely wouldn't, tell them anything that might tread upon Watcher secrets. All the old elf wanted to do was guide Alistair and his friends through the Fallwood, then finally into the Fiend. The demanded price for such a dangerous undertaking: to head into a land where no man has ever returned. Khazon's lair, and the origin of spiraling death. Fuludar Baindar. That was it. No coins or jewels, nor favors or potential deals with Alistair's people, just food. Alistair narrowed his eyes at the old elf. There was something more to the strange Fekin than just being old. He just knew it. The sheer confidence that Theopalu placed in himself to be able to pass through the Fiendwood unscathed was what got him hired in the first place. That, and his apparent age. Who was to say? Theopalu could possibly be even older than the Fiendwood itself. "You all right, Alistair?" Kitka asked, appearing like a pale phantom at Alistair's side. "You look, not all right," he finished in an unsure tone. About a head shorter than Alistair, and as pale as spirit, Kitka looked to be the type to stay inside all day. Yet that pale, almost silvery skin was the result of exclusively hunting during the nighttime. The dark-haired Kitka looked to be suffering worse than even Alistair was, based on the deep red tinge of sunsear on his cheeks. Thankfully, Alistair had become used to Kitka's sudden appearances long ago, else Alistair might have tried to bring his warhammer down upon the smaller man's head. "I'm all right. It's just, how can we really trust Theopalu? We know nothing about him, or why he agreed to do any of this." "It's suspicious," Alistair said honestly, making sure to lower his tone so Theopalu didn't hear supposedly all he wants is food. "But I don't believe that for a damn second." Kitka adjusted the red cloak he wore as his dark eyes found the elder elf. "He's all right. He just eats a lot." Indeed, Theopalu had proven capable of devouring with ease plates an orc warlord would have had trouble downing. There were plenty of other ways for a former watcher to get food. So why take such a dangerous job in the Fiend? He focused his attention on the old elf ahead once more, seeing the elf stop a moment to pick up a particularly large spider. Its leg span was nearly the size of the elf's head. Alistair felt a cold shudder of revulsion as he watched Theopalu's jaw unhinged to swallow the poor arachnid whole, the old elf barely stopping to chew his unfortunate morsel as he continued to move along. Kitka began nervously as he too looked away from the elf's back. "He eats a whole lot. It's just how he is. It's ridiculous is what it is," Alistair replied, unable to keep some bafflement from his tone. "It is not hot. Natural. He continued, pausing for emphasis. "Some of the things we can do aren't exactly natural either, my friend." Elum told him with a small laugh. "I feel it might be a bit much to say that our old feeble elf's appetite is strange, when we can do things only talked about in stories." Alistair turned his head to lock eyes with Illumum, his icy blues meeting Illum's fiery reds. "We can't let that slip," Alistair whispered sharply. "You know what could happen to us if we're found out. It's best to avoid speaking of it entirely." Alistair finished, taking a deep breath and looking to see if the trees had ears. In this forest, who was to say that they didn't? Illum then looked to the branches overhead, straining his eyes likely in an attempt to discern any watchers tailing. Kitka cleared his throat and promptly wrapped his arms around both Alistair and Illum's necks. Before either could react, Kitka quickly began whispering, making sure to keep his eyes planted firmly ahead. 3 of them overhead, 5 behind. "Don't look." Kitka rushed out in a hushed tone as he pulled Alistair and Illum's heads back down. Alistair hadn't been able to discern anything amongst the trees when he made that glance, besides Nulvi dragging her feet behind the rest of them. not too far to be at risk of being snatched away by watchers or forest creatures. The woman thankfully hadn't noticed the interaction ahead of her, but then again, that girl wouldn't have noticed if a flaming frog had jumped up her skirt. Thanks to his foolish reaction to Kidka's words, the watchers surely knew that the party was aware of their presence. Hopefully, that would not provoke them in any way. Alistair would hate to have to summon Baelmeal just to fight watchers. They did not deserve to feel the angel's teeth, grinding them to paste. Yeah, I love you both like brothers. Kidka yelled in the most forced tone Alistair had ever heard in his life. I just like hugging you, is all you can. The poor guy wasn't exactly the best with words, but Alistair decided to play along. Yeah, of course. Love you too. Alistair said casually as he quickly shrugged out of Kidka's grasp. Elum, however, was not as gentle. Do not touch me, you reek of pig guts and sour fruit. Ilm shouted, poking Kidka in the chest and forcing the other man back a few steps. Kidka, for his part, looked innocently confused a moment before. He finally replied with, "But you smell like sulfur. Like it's bad. Like really bad. Yeah, you do smell like butt rock." Alistair laughed forcefully, roughly patting Ilum's shoulder. Now let's keep going, please. He whispered harshly through clenched teeth as he not so gently pushed Elum along. Twindle had turned to look at them, a blonde brow raised before all three simply smiled and waved. The last thing they all wanted to do was get a talking to about Athena's tranquility, and how peace must be upheld at any cost. Sometimes that peace had to come about through a thorough beating. Thankfully, none of them had pushed Twindle to that point yet. But he could tell her deep well of patience was being strained. Not that Alistair would just allow Twindle to bend him over her knee and paddle him, of course. It was just a confrontation he'd rather avoid. He looked past her to see a break in the trees. A field? The Opalu paused a long while before passing into that breach in the trees. For what reason, Alistair didn't know. The old elf had only stopped in his tracks when it was time to let them sleep, and there was still a decent amount of daylight left. It was when he drew closer that he saw it. A giant steel egg had smashed through the grassy field, splitting the soil beneath it in half. No, this wasn't an egg. Could this have been one of the falling stars? Had one landed in the fallwood? Curiosity drew him forth, and Alistair soon found himself standing only a few paces away from the metal mass. It had shot through a few trees when it crashed. Based on the fact that the trail continued on past where the star now sat, something had dragged it out of the woods and back into the middle of this field. But what could have been strong enough to do that? Maybe the Watchers had all worked together to haul it out. Perhaps they had used one of their moving trees. Yes, that had to be it. But, why was it still sitting here? Wouldn't they have taken it somewhere more secure to study it? A strange omen. Twindle muttered, I hope it means we're on the right path, Athena willing. She continued as Elum rounded the star. Alistair was still staring at the front of the thing. Why did the star have what almost looked to be a door? There was a strange device next to the sealed entrance, embedded into the wall, bearing 9 letters atop what appeared to be miniature pressure plates. No, not letters. Those were Psi-Hara numerical digits. All the way from 1 to 9. Was it some kind of security against intruders? His brain continued to work as he stared at the thing, the gears in his head whirring at full speed. Perhaps it was similar to that of a combination lock. Yes, that had to be it. One likely had to push the pressure plates in the correct order to get the egg to open. If that were the case, what was the combination? More important,